Imagine waking up one morning as Queen of England and discovering that your entire marriage has become a criminal investigation. Not a divorce, not a separation, not even one of those royal arrangements where everyone smiles in public and quietly moves to opposite ends of the palace. A criminal investigation. Your friends are being arrested. Your brother is being questioned. A musician from your household has confessed to sleeping with you. The man you married has stopped speaking to you. The government is collecting dates, places, rumors, jokes, conversations, and glances, and arranging them into a story that ends with one conclusion. You must die. And here is the part that makes the story of Anne Boleyn so unsettling nearly 500 years later.
3 years earlier, Henry VIII had overturned the religious and political order of his kingdom in the process of making Anne his wife. 3 years. That is less time than some of us have spent deciding whether to replace a perfectly good sofa. Henry waited years to marry Anne. He challenged papal authority. He broke England's relationship with Rome. He made himself supreme head of the English Church. He crowned Anne with extraordinary ceremony. And then, in May of 1536, the woman who had once seemed impossible for him to live without was arrested, accused of adultery with 5 men, accused of incest with her own brother, accused of imagining the king's death, tried, convicted, and beheaded. The whole collapse took less than 3 weeks. So tonight, we are not going to tell the familiar story of Anne Boleyn as a tragic queen who flew too close to the sun.
We are reopening the case. Think of this as a Tudor cold case, except instead of fingerprints, we have diplomatic letters, legal records, terrified courtiers, contradictory dates, and one king with absolute power and a very urgent desire for a different future. Was Anne Boleyn guilty? Was she careless? Was she framed by Thomas Cromwell? Did Henry VIII order Cromwell to find a way out of the marriage? Or did a poisonous court culture produce a scandal so explosive that once it started, nobody could stop it? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, if the charges were false, how many people had to know? Because conspiracies sound dramatic when we imagine secret rooms and whispered instructions. But history teaches a less glamorous lesson. Sometimes an injustice does not need hundreds of conspirators. Sometimes it needs one powerful person who wants a particular result, a few ambitious people who understand what result is wanted, and everyone else deciding that today is an excellent day to mind their own business. If you have ever worked in an office, you already understand more about Tudor politics than you think. Only the Tudor Performance Review could end with an execution. Anne Boleyn did not begin life as an obvious future queen. Even the year of her birth remains uncertain, usually placed around 1501, though scholars have debated it. She belonged to the ambitious Boleyn family, but she was not born a princess. She spent formative years in the sophisticated courts of the Netherlands and France, where she learned French manners, music, fashion, conversation, and the particular art of being noticed without appearing to be trying too hard.
That last skill remains useful in every century. When Anne returned to England, she entered the orbit of Henry VIII's court, and Henry's court was not simply a glamorous palace full of velvet sleeves and lute music. It was the country's political headquarters, celebrity culture, marriage market, church debate, family business, and rumor factory, all in one building. Imagine Parliament, Vogue, LinkedIn, a royal wedding, and the world's most judgmental group chat taking place in the same hallway. That was court life. Henry VIII, at this stage, was not yet the enormous, aging tyrant of popular imagination. He had once been athletic, musical, charismatic, educated, and physically impressive. He loved ceremony, hunting, tournaments, music, theology, and being admired, especially that last one. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon since 1509. Catherine was no foolish or passive woman. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, deeply educated, politically experienced, devout, and capable. She had even served as regent while Henry was campaigning in France. But their marriage had produced only one surviving child, Princess Mary. Henry wanted a legitimate son, not because daughters were incapable of ruling. History would eventually make that point rather forcefully, through Mary, and especially through Anne's own daughter, Elizabeth. But in Henry's mind, the Tudor dynasty was still young and vulnerable. His father had won the crown after decades of civil war. A disputed succession could mean catastrophe. So Henry became increasingly convinced that he needed a male heir. Then Anne Boleyn entered the story. Exactly when Henry fell in love with her is difficult to pin down, but by the mid-1520s his desire was unmistakable. And Anne did something that changed everything. She did not simply become his mistress. She resisted. We should be cautious about romanticizing this. Anne's motives are impossible to reconstruct perfectly, and life at court was not a modern dating show where everyone had equal power and a clean exit strategy. The king was the king. But Anne did refuse the role Henry had offered other women. She was not prepared, at least publicly, and for a significant period, to settle for being another royal mistress. Henry responded with a flood of letters and pursuit. Several of his love letters survive. They reveal something we sometimes forget because we know the ending. Henry was deeply obsessed with Anne. And obsession can look very romantic from a distance. At the beginning, it is poems, gifts, longing, dramatic promises, changing the world for love. Later, you realize that the person who says, "I would tear down the heavens for you," may eventually discover that you are part of the heavens. Women over 45 have earned the right to be suspicious of grand gestures without emotional regulation. Henry began trying to end his marriage to Catherine. The legal argument was complicated. Catherine had previously been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, though she maintained that the marriage had never been consummated. Henry argued that his marriage to his brother's widow violated biblical law, and that the lack of a surviving son was evidence of divine displeasure. Catherine rejected this completely. So did her powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V. And Pope Clement VII was in an almost impossible political position. What Henry expected to be an annulment became what the court called the king's great matter. Years passed. Anne waited. Henry waited. Diplomats watched. Europe gossiped. The Pope delayed. And every delay made the question larger. This was no longer merely, can Henry marry Anne? It became, who has ultimate authority over the English Church? At some point in this process, the romance became a constitutional earthquake. Thomas Wolsey, Henry's great minister, failed to obtain the annulment and fell from power. New men rose. Among them was Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell is one of those historical figures who changes depending on which book you read. Brilliant administrator, religious reformer, political modernizer, cold-blooded fixer, loyal servant, terrifying operator. If Tudor England had LinkedIn, Cromwell's profile would simply say, "I solve difficult problems." And then everyone would quietly lock their doors. By the early 1530s, Henry's government moved toward a revolutionary solution. Instead of waiting for Rome to approve his decision, England would change the structure of authority itself. Parliament passed legislation that reduced papal power in England. Henry became supreme head of the Church of England. The marriage to Catherine was declared invalid.
Henry married Anne, likely in a secret ceremony in January 1533. It is tempting to summarize this by saying Henry created a new church for Anne. That is catchy. It is also too simple. The English Reformation had political, theological, financial, constitutional, and dynastic causes. Reformist ideas were already moving through Europe. Henry's break with Rome did not instantly make England Protestant in the modern sense, and Henry himself remained doctrinally conservative in many ways.
But Anne was absolutely central to the crisis that accelerated the break. The relationship between Henry and Anne became tied to the future of the monarchy and the religious structure of the country. That made Anne more than a wife. It made her a symbol. And symbols are useful when they represent victory. They become dangerous when the story changes. Anne was crowned queen on the 1st of June, 1533. She was pregnant. The ceremony was magnificent, public, and political. Only a few months later, in September, she gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth. At the time, this was disappointing to Henry because he wanted a son. But Elizabeth would eventually become one of the most famous monarchs in English history. History enjoys irony so much that sometimes it feels personally involved. The king who destroyed one marriage because he needed a male heir would become the father of two reigning queens. The daughter of the woman executed as a traitor would rule for more than 4 decades. You could not pitch it to a television network because they would say the foreshadowing was too obvious. But in 1533, nobody knew that. Anne still had one essential job in the brutal logic of Tudor monarchy: produce a surviving son. And here we need to stop judging Anne's reproductive history with the cold language of dynastic success and failure. Pregnancy in the 16th century was dangerous, unpredictable, and emotionally devastating when it went wrong. Anne appears to have had unsuccessful pregnancies after Elizabeth. The details are not always clear because the surviving evidence is incomplete and sometimes contradictory. But we know that in January 1536, she miscarried a male fetus. The timing was catastrophic. Catherine of Aragon had died only weeks earlier. With Catherine gone, Henry's first marriage no longer created the same diplomatic obstacle to a new marriage. And Henry was already showing interest in Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies. Think about the emotional cruelty of that position. Anne had spent years waiting to become queen. She had survived public hostility, religious controversy, and the hatred of people who regarded Catherine as the true queen. She had finally married Henry. She had given him a daughter. She had endured pregnancies that did not produce the son he demanded. And now, just 3 years into the marriage, another woman was beginning to occupy the romantic space Anne herself had once occupied. There is a phrase we use now: how you get him may be how you lose him. History is usually more complicated than phrases, but I suspect Anne would have understood the sentiment. Jane Seymour has often been cast as Anne's opposite: quiet, where Anne was sharp; traditional, where Anne was reformist; gentle, where Anne was confrontational. Some of that contrast may come from later storytelling rather than reality, but politically, Jane offered one thing Anne no longer could: a reset. A new wife meant a new chance at a son, and kings who believe their personal desires are matters of national survival can become very inventive about the word necessity. By the spring of 1536, Anne and Thomas Cromwell had also come into conflict. Once they had been useful allies in the reformist cause, but agreement is easy when two people are climbing the same staircase. The problem begins when they reach the landing and discover they want different rooms. One major issue concerned the wealth of dissolved religious houses. As monasteries were suppressed, enormous amounts of land and property became available. Anne appears to have favoured directing at least some of these resources toward charitable and educational purposes connected with reform. Cromwell and the Crown had other priorities. There were also tensions over foreign policy. How decisive these disagreements were in Anne's destruction remains debated. This matters because the neatest version of the story says Cromwell hated Anne, decided to destroy her, invented the charges, and presented Henry with a convenient package. History may not be that neat. Cromwell later indicated that he had acted with royal authorization. And this is where our cold case becomes interesting. We have motive. But whose motive? Cromwell may have wanted Anne removed. Henry may have wanted Anne removed. A Seymour faction may have benefited from Anne's removal. Conservative courtiers may have hated her religious politics. Foreign diplomats certainly watched her position closely. But benefiting from a death is not proof of causing it. Every detective show teaches us that in the first 10 minutes. Although, to be fair, every detective show also introduces one suspicious man polishing a wine glass for no reason. The first crack in the case appeared through court gossip. In April 1536, Anne had a dangerous conversation with Sir Henry Norris. Norris was one of Henry VIII's closest servants and an important courtier. Anne teased him about why he had not yet married. The exchange moved into the language of courtly love. This was a stylized culture in which courtiers could flirt, compliment, and play romantic games in ways that did not necessarily imply actual sexual relationships. The problem was that Anne's joke touched the one subject nobody should joke about around an insecure Tudor king: his death. According to the report that survives, Anne suggested that Norris looked for dead men's shoes and might hope to have her if something happened to the king. Norris reacted with horror. She reportedly told him she could undo him. They argued. In another century, this might have been remembered as an awkward conversation. In 1536, under a treason law that made imagining the king's death extraordinarily dangerous, it was potential evidence. There is a lesson here for all of us. Never make a joke in a workplace where the HR department has an executioner. Around the same period, Anne also had a sharp conversation with Mark Smeaton, a young musician in her household. She asked why he seemed sad. He apparently replied that a look from her would be enough. Anne rejected him, emphasizing the gap in status between them. Again, perhaps harmless. Again, overheard. Again, later transformed by context. This is one of the creepiest features of Anne's downfall. Many of the pieces used against her were not secret acts. They were fragments of ordinary court life, conversations, jokes, flirtation, irritation, proximity. Once the government decided to view those fragments through the lens of sexual treason, everything changed meaning. Anyone who has ever watched a group chat screenshot escape its original context knows how this works. Now imagine the screenshot is being interpreted by people who can legally cut off your head. On April 30th, Mark Smeaton was arrested. He was interrogated at Thomas Cromwell's house. What happened during that interrogation remains disputed. Some contemporary reports suggested he was tortured or subjected to severe pressure. Others are less specific. What we know is that Smeaton confessed to sexual relations with Anne. He would become the only accused man to confess to an actual sexual relationship with her. That confession was explosive. Because once one man confessed, the entire atmosphere changed. Imagine you are Henry VIII. You are already worried about your marriage. You are already interested in Jane Seymour. Your queen has failed to produce the son you want. You hear that a male musician has confessed to sleeping with her. Now the question is no longer, is this rumor true? The question becomes, how many others?
And that shift is psychologically important. Once people believe the first accusation, they stop evaluating later evidence neutrally. They begin organizing everything around the assumption that the crime happened. It is confirmation bias wearing velvet. On May 1st, Henry attended the May Day jousts at Greenwich. Sir Henry Norris was with him. The king left suddenly. Norris was questioned. Henry reportedly offered him a pardon if he would tell the truth. Norris did not confess. By dawn the next morning, he was in the Tower. On May 2nd, Anne was watching tennis when she received orders to appear before a royal commission. She was questioned. Then she was arrested. Imagine that journey. Anne had first entered the Tower not as a prisoner, but in connection with her coronation. The apartments had been prepared for her as queen. Now she returned through the same fortress under guard. According to reports, she asked whether she would be put in a dungeon. She was instead housed in royal lodgings. The location was comfortable by prison standards. The situation was not. Anne became emotionally volatile in captivity. She cried. She laughed. She spoke rapidly. She tried to understand what was happening. She remembered conversations. She worried about her mother. She worried about Elizabeth. And crucially, everything she said was being observed by women placed around her and reported to Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower. Kingston then reported to Cromwell. Anne was essentially living inside a 16th century reality show where the producers were building a treason case. There was no private diary room. Her panic became evidence collection. When she mentioned her conversations with Norris or Smeaton, she may have been trying to defend herself. But every recollection gave investigators another thread. This is why historical documents require caution. A prisoner's words recorded by officials are not a neutral transcript. We have fragments, we have summaries, we have people with agendas. We have spelling that looks as if English itself was having a nervous breakdown. But the emotional shape is clear. Anne could not understand how the accusations had become so large so quickly. Soon her brother, George Boleyn, was arrested. George, Lord Rochford, was sophisticated, politically active, and close to Anne. The allegation that Anne had committed incest with her own brother was not simply another adultery charge. It was designed to be horrifying. It turned sexual misconduct into moral monstrosity, and it transformed the Boleyn family itself into something corrupt. If you wanted to destroy Anne's reputation completely, accusing her of sleeping with a handsome courtier was not enough. You accused her of sleeping with her brother. The charge did more than condemn her legally. It contaminated her memory. That is why we still remember it 5 centuries later. The government eventually accused Anne of sexual relationships with 5 men: Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and her brother, George Boleyn. The indictment described multiple alleged encounters at different royal residences and on different dates. And this is where the prosecution begins to look strange. Modern historians, most famously Anne's biographer Eric Ives, have pointed out that a large proportion of the alleged dates can be challenged because Anne, or the accused man, appears to have been somewhere else. In other words, the government did not merely fail to produce the sort of evidence we would expect today. Some allegations appear physically impossible. This is the Tudor equivalent of accusing someone of committing a crime in Miami while their credit card, phone, passport, and 40 wedding guests place them in Chicago. Except in Anne's case, the authorities had access to royal household records. They knew where the Queen traveled. This creates one of the strongest reasons for suspecting fabrication, or at least reckless construction. If investigators were carefully discovering real affairs, why include dates that could be contradicted by the Queen's known movements? There are several possible answers. Maybe the dates were approximate. Maybe surviving records are incomplete. Maybe the prosecution was assembling gossip too quickly to check. Or maybe accuracy did not matter because the verdict did not depend on evidence being strong. That last possibility is difficult to ignore. The indictment was not a modern forensic file. There were no fingerprints, no letters from lovers, no eyewitness testimony preserved that demonstrates sexual acts, no pregnancy attributed to another man, no secret apartment discovered, no coded love correspondence, no suspicious hotel receipt, not even a Tudor version of "sent from my iPhone." Instead, there were accusations of meetings, kisses, sexual relations, gifts, and conspiratorial conversations. And one confession from Smeaton. The others denied guilt.
Even Eustace Chapuys, the imperial ambassador and one of Anne's most hostile contemporary observers, later reported that the men, apart from Smeaton, had been condemned without valid proof or confession. Pause on that. Chapuys disliked Anne. He had supported Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary. He frequently referred to Anne with hostile language. If Anne had been obviously guilty, Chapuys was not the man you would expect to rush to her defense. Yet even he expressed doubt about the proof. That is like your ex-husband's mother saying, "Actually, I think this criticism of her is unfair." You write down the date. Because something unusual has happened. Now, one historian, G.W. Bernard, has argued that Anne's guilt cannot simply be ruled out, and that deserves to be taken seriously. A good investigation cannot begin by deciding which heroine we want and then rearranging the evidence around her. The Tudor court was intensely sexualized, competitive, and secretive. Powerful people did take enormous risks. Queens were not physically monitored every second, and absence of surviving evidence is not proof that nothing happened. But Bernard himself has acknowledged that the case is not proven in a modern sense, and most historians have found the scale of the accusations difficult to believe. 5 men, multiple locations, over a long period, including the king's close servants, including Anne's brother. For this to be true, Anne would have had to conduct an extraordinarily reckless series of affairs inside one of the most observed households in Europe. Queens did not live alone. They dressed with attendants. They ate with attendants. They traveled with attendants. Their bedchambers were managed by servants. Their pregnancies were matters of state. The idea that Anne secretly maintained a rotating cast of lovers would require not merely passion, but project management. Color-coded calendar, shared spreadsheet. A woman coordinating 5 adulterous relationships in the Tudor royal household would deserve at least a certificate in operations management. And the prosecution's case still contained impossible dates. So let us ask the detective question. Who benefited? Jane Seymour benefited most obviously. Within days of Anne's death, she would become Henry's 3rd wife. But there is little strong evidence that Jane personally engineered Anne's prosecution. Being the replacement is not the same as being the architect. The Seymour family benefited. Conservative factions benefited. People who disliked Anne benefited. But Thomas Cromwell had the machinery to make things happen. By 1536, Cromwell was central to Henry's government. He understood law, parliament, administration, networks, and royal psychology. He knew how to convert the king's desires into documents. That talent had helped make Anne queen. It may also have helped destroy her. Cromwell later told Chapuys that he had been authorized and commissioned by Henry to pursue the case. The famous wording has sometimes been interpreted to mean Cromwell admitted devising or conspiring the affair. But context matters. Cromwell was not necessarily describing a rogue operation against Henry's wishes. He may have been describing a task the king himself had ordered. This changes the movie. Instead of Cromwell as mastermind manipulating an innocent husband, we may have Cromwell as the executive producer of a result Henry wanted. And if you have ever seen a senior manager say, "I am not telling you what conclusion to reach, but I do need the report by Friday," you know how ambiguous instructions can work. Perhaps Henry said, "Investigate." Perhaps Cromwell understood, "Find something." Perhaps Henry genuinely believed Anne was guilty. Perhaps he did not want to know how the sausage was made. Perhaps he wanted freedom to marry Jane. We cannot hear the private conversations, but we can examine what happened next. The investigation moved with extraordinary speed. Smeaton was arrested April 30th. Norris followed. Anne and George were arrested May 2nd. Other men were swept in. Grand juries returned indictments. The four commoners, or non-peer defendants, who stood trial together, were tried on May 12th. Anne and George were tried on May 15th. By May 19th, Anne was dead. 17 days from arrest to execution. 17. Some of us have packages that take longer to clear customs. And this was the Queen of England. The charges involved adultery, incest, conspiracy, and treason at the highest level of government. Yet the state moved from suspicion to execution with astonishing speed. Speed by itself does not prove innocence. Tudor justice was faster than modern justice. But this was not a simple theft case. The political stakes could hardly have been higher. And there is another disturbing detail. The men accused with Anne were tried before she was. On May 12th, Smeaton, Norris, Weston, and Brereton were convicted.
Their verdicts effectively established that adulterous relationships with the Queen had happened before Anne herself appeared for trial. 3 days later, Anne entered a courtroom where the alleged lovers had already been declared guilty. Her case did not begin with a clean slate. The slate had already been engraved. Anne and George were tried in the Tower on May 15th before a court of peers. The proceedings were presided over by their own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. This sounds so bizarre to modern ears that it almost feels fictional. Imagine turning up for the most important trial of your life and discovering Uncle Thomas at the front. Family reunion, but make it lethal. Norfolk's relationship with the Boleyns was complicated, and Tudor kinship did not automatically mean affection or loyalty. He was performing an official role as High Steward. Still, the symbolism is brutal. Anne was judged by the aristocratic world that had celebrated her coronation 3 years earlier. The court found her guilty. We do not possess a full transcript of everything said at Anne's trial. That absence matters. Later retellings often give the trial a cinematic clarity that the surviving record does not support. We know the charges, we know the verdict, we know some reports of what happened. But we cannot reconstruct every argument word for word. This uncertainty should make us more careful, not less. Anne defended herself. Observers reported that she spoke effectively. But effectiveness was not enough. The peers returned a guilty verdict. George was also convicted. According to some accounts, when the verdict was announced, Anne remained composed. The sentence for a woman convicted of treason could involve burning, though Henry commuted the method to beheading. And then something happened that reveals how thoroughly the marriage itself was being erased. On May 17th, Archbishop Thomas Cromwell declared Henry and Anne's marriage invalid. That creates a logical absurdity that historians have long noticed. If the marriage was invalid, in what sense had Anne committed adultery against Henry as his lawful wife? Tudor law and politics did not require consistency in the way a modern courtroom might. The point was not philosophical elegance. The point was removal. On the same day, May 17th,
The 5 men accused in connection with Anne were executed on Tower Hill. George Boleyn, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton. 5 lives ended. And it is easy for Anne's fame to swallow them. But they were not props. They were people with families, careers, loyalties, enemies, and futures. Norris had been close to the king. Weston was young. Brereton was a powerful royal official in Wales and the Marches. Smeaton was a musician of relatively humble background compared with the others. George was Anne's brother. The government's story needed them to become lovers, traitors, and evidence. 2 days later, Anne would follow. Before her execution, she prepared herself religiously. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence historians discuss when assessing her innocence. On the night before her death, Anne reportedly swore before receiving the Eucharist that she had not been unfaithful to Henry. To a modern secular audience, an oath before communion may sound symbolic. To a deeply religious 16th century Christian facing imminent death, it was terrifyingly serious.
If Anne knowingly lied in that moment, she would have believed she was risking eternal damnation within hours of meeting God. Could a guilty person still lie? Of course. Human beings are complicated. Desperate people rationalize. But the religious context makes the oath meaningful. Anne had almost nothing left to gain politically. She knew she was going to die. She had no audience to win for a comeback tour. There would be no memoir, no podcast, no revenge interview with Oprah. She was preparing for judgment in the theological sense, and she maintained her innocence. The execution was scheduled for May 18th, then delayed until May 19th. Henry had arranged for an expert swordsman from France to carry out the beheading. This has sometimes been presented as mercy. Compared with the uncertainty of an axe, a skilled swordsman could indeed offer a faster death.
But there is something chilling about the planning. A specialized executioner had been secured. The machinery of death was not improvised. Anne climbed the scaffold within the tower on the morning of May 19th. She was around 35, perhaps younger depending on the disputed date of her birth. She wore a dark gown and prepared herself with remarkable composure according to the surviving accounts. Her final speech did not attack Henry. She did not accuse Cromwell. She did not expose secrets. She praised the king. Why? Fear for Elizabeth may have shaped every word. Anne's daughter was not yet 3 years old. A condemned mother attacking the king publicly might only make the child's future more dangerous. So Anne did what women trapped inside power structures have done for centuries.
She managed the feelings of the man who had destroyed her because someone she loved still depended on him. That is not weakness. That is strategy after hope has gone. She asked people to pray for her. She knelt. The executioner used the sword. According to the traditional account, the blow was swift, and Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was dead. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. No grand royal tomb, no magnificent monument designed by Henry. The woman whose marriage had transformed the monarchy was placed beneath the floor of a chapel inside the fortress where she died. And then the court moved on with almost indecent speed. Jane Seymour and Henry were betrothed the next day. They married on May 30th, 11 days after Anne's execution. 11 days. I have leftovers in the freezer with a longer mourning period. This does not prove that Henry fabricated the charges, but psychologically, it is hard to ignore. The king did not behave like a man whose life had been shattered by the shocking discovery that his beloved wife had betrayed him with 5 men and plotted his death. At least, not for long. He behaved like a man moving briskly into the next plan.
Henry's defenders could argue that kings did not have the luxury of private grief. The succession mattered. A new marriage was political business. True, but even by Tudor standards, the speed attracted attention. And it raises the central question. When did Henry decide he wanted Anne gone? Before the investigation? During it? Or only after he came to believe the accusations? Historians still disagree. One interpretation is that Anne really was caught in an unexpected scandal. Court gossip reached Cromwell. Smeaton confessed. Henry believed the confession. Anne's own reckless language about the king's death made the accusations seem plausible. The machinery of investigation then accelerated. Historian Susanna Lipscomb has argued for a version close to this. Anne may have been innocent of adultery, but destroyed by dangerous words, rumor, and a king who became convinced she was guilty. This theory is important because it does not require a master conspiracy, and history is often made by chaos. We love villains with folders labeled "secret plan." Real disasters are frequently less organized. A rumor, a frightened confession, a jealous husband, an ambitious minister, a queen known for sharp conversation, a law broad enough to criminalize imagination. And suddenly, everybody is running downhill. Another interpretation places more responsibility on Thomas Cromwell. Anne had become politically inconvenient. Cromwell had reason to fear her influence. Their disagreements over monastic wealth and foreign policy were real. Once Henry gave permission to investigate, Cromwell constructed a case large enough that Anne could never escape it. Why 5 men? Why incest? Why conspiracy against the king? Because if the goal was simply to end a marriage, Henry had already demonstrated that annulments were possible. But Anne was not Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had powerful international relatives and enormous public sympathy. Sending her away had created years of resistance. Anne also had a daughter whose legitimacy could matter. A criminal conviction destroyed Anne politically and morally. It made opposition dangerous. It turned her supporters into potential associates of a traitor. It cleared the path. And it warned everyone else. This was not merely divorce. It was reputation demolition. The third interpretation places Henry at the center. In this reading, Cromwell did not manipulate the king. He served him. Henry wanted freedom from a marriage that had failed to produce a son. He was attracted to Jane Seymour. Anne had become difficult. The political circumstances had changed after Catherine's death. So Henry instructed Cromwell to solve the problem. Cromwell solved problems professionally. The result was a prosecution. This interpretation fits a broader pattern in Henry's reign. Henry could be generous, cultured, affectionate, and charming. He could also allow people close to him to absorb blame for policies he wanted. Ministers rose high and fell hard. Thomas Wolsey, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell himself 4 years after Anne. Henry often emerged as the permanent center, while former intimates became disposable. This is why Anne's story is bigger than a bad marriage. It is a study in power. We sometimes ask whether Henry loved Anne. I think that is the wrong question. He probably did, in whatever way Henry understood love. The surviving letters, the years of pursuit, the political risk, the intensity of the relationship, all of this suggests genuine passion. But love is not the opposite of danger. Possession can masquerade as love. Obsession can coexist with resentment. A person can adore the version of you who fulfills their fantasy and punish the real you for failing to remain inside it. Many mature women understand this distinction without needing a Tudor historian to explain it. The frightening question is not, did Henry ever love Anne? It is,
What happened to Henry's love when Anne could no longer deliver what he believed she promised? A son, dynastic certainty, religious validation, excitement, a new beginning. Anne had once represented possibility. By 1536, she represented disappointment. And powerful people are often most dangerous when they confuse disappointment with betrayal. There is also the matter of gender. Anne's behavior was interpreted through standards that gave men far more sexual freedom than women. Henry had mistresses. His infidelity did not make him a traitor. Anne's alleged infidelity became a national security crisis. The double standard is so large you can see it from space. And yes, we should avoid lazily imposing 21st century values on the 16th century. But we do not need modern feminism to notice that Tudor society judged queens by exceptionally harsh sexual standards. A queen's body was political property because the legitimacy of heirs depended on certainty of paternity. That made adultery by a queen not merely a marital offense, but a dynastic threat. Still, it is striking that the man demanding perfect sexual loyalty was Henry VIII. Sir, please. Even history occasionally needs to raise one eyebrow. Anne's reputation after death became another battlefield. Catholic writers portrayed her as immoral, ambitious, monstrous, even physically deformed, in stories that appeared long after her lifetime. Protestant writers later had reasons to defend her because she was the mother of Elizabeth I and associated with reform. Jane Boleyn, George's wife, was later blamed in some traditions for giving evidence that helped condemn Anne and George, though historians have challenged the strength of that claim. Stories accumulated. Anne acquired an extra finger, a large mole, witchcraft, seduction, incest, ghosts. Once a woman becomes controversial enough, people begin decorating her like a Christmas tree of accusations. The six-finger story is especially persistent. There is no reliable contemporary evidence that Anne had 6 fingers, but the story survived because it fit the later image of her as unnatural. This is how propaganda works. It does not always persuade you with one giant lie. Sometimes it adds small visual details until a person begins to feel guilty, even when you cannot remember what the evidence was. 500 years later, popular culture still debates what Anne looked like. Was she beautiful? Some contemporaries did not describe her as conventionally gorgeous. Others emphasized her dark eyes, intelligence, elegance, style, and magnetism. This may be the most relatable detail in the entire story. Attraction is not a census form. A person can walk into a room and reorganize everybody's attention without meeting whatever beauty standard the local committee approved. Anne seems to have had that quality. Presence. And presence is powerful. It can also create enemies. She was not universally liked. She could be proud. She could be sharp-tongued. She could be vindictive. She participated in brutal politics. We do Anne no favors by turning her into a perfect modern heroine, trapped among villains. She was a 16th century political actor. She supported causes. She rewarded allies. She attacked opponents. She benefited from Catherine's displacement and Mary's humiliation. She could be cruel in a cruel system. Innocence of adultery does not equal sainthood. This distinction matters, because women do not need to be nice in order to deserve due process. They do not need flawless personalities in order not to be framed. One of the most dangerous habits in storytelling is deciding that a victim must first pass a character test. Was she likable? Was she kind? Was she a good mother? Did she speak politely? Did she have enemies? None of those questions determines whether the evidence was true. If you have ever watched a woman on television be judged for her facial expression,
while a man beside her is being investigated for an actual crime. You know the pattern. Anne's sharpness became part of the case against her reputation. Henry's violence became part of his mystique.
Now let us return to the evidence. The prosecution alleged numerous meetings between Anne and her supposed lovers, but royal travel itineraries undermine many of them. Sun dates placed Anne at one palace when records suggest she was somewhere else. Some alleged encounters happened around periods of pregnancy or childbirth. This does not mathematically prove every allegation false, but it weakens confidence in the indictment as a carefully verified document. Then there is the lack of confessions. Smeaton confessed. The others did not. Sir Edward Bainton, involved in gathering evidence, reportedly acknowledged that no man confessed anything actual against Anne except Mark. That is extraordinary. If the Queen had really maintained multiple affairs, investigators might have expected at least one other accused man to save himself by cooperating. Henry reportedly offered Norris a pardon if he confessed. Norris refused. That refusal cost him his life. Maybe Norris was protecting Anne. Maybe he was protecting his honor. Maybe he was innocent. But a man facing execution turning down a route toward mercy deserves our attention. Then there is the incest allegation. George and Anne were close siblings. They shared intellectual and religious interests. They participated in reformist networks. But evidence of a sexual relationship is extremely weak. The accusation feels designed for maximum horror. And because it was so shocking, it did exactly what shocking accusations often do. It made people assume that where there is that much smoke, there must be fire. But sometimes smoke is produced by a smoke machine. Ask any theater technician. Then there is the alleged conspiracy to kill Henry. This part was legally crucial. Adultery by itself, however scandalous, was not automatically high treason under the old treason statute. But imagining or compassing the king's death could be treason under Henry's expanded legal framework. Anne's conversation with Norris about dead men's shoes gave prosecutors something they could interpret as imagining the king's death. Was it wise? Absolutely not. Was it evidence of an actual assassination plot? That is another matter. If Anne planned to kill Henry, what was the plan? Who would do it? When? How? What weapons? What poison? What allies? What preparations? Where is the operational evidence? The indictment gives us conspiracy language, but the surviving material does not reveal a developed murder scheme. It sounds less like Mission Impossible and more like a conversation nobody should have had near a Tudor monarch. There is also Henry's behavior toward Jane Seymour. By early 1536, he was courting her. Jane reportedly returned a gift of money, protecting her reputation and signaling that she would not simply become another mistress. Whether this was sincere modesty, family strategy, or both, the effect was powerful. Henry's interest increased. The parallels with Anne's own earlier resistance were obvious. This is the moment in the documentary where every woman watching quietly says, "Oh, Henry, we have seen this movie." New woman, new fantasy, new promise of a clean start. The previous relationship is suddenly recast as the problem. The only difference is that most midlife relationship transitions do not involve Parliament. Thank God for small mercies. Still, we should resist the temptation to make Jane the villain. Women at Tudor court operated under extreme pressure. Jane's family had ambitions. Jane herself may have wanted the marriage. She may also have understood that refusing the king indefinitely was not a simple option. The structure of power matters more than the romantic triangle. The person with the greatest freedom in this story was Henry. That is why responsibility keeps returning to him. What did Henry know?
We cannot know exactly. Did he personally review the dates in the indictment? Did he ask whether Anne could physically have been at the alleged locations? Did he care? Did Cromwell present the charges as established truth? Did Henry want to believe them? People often imagine belief as something passive. Evidence arrives, we process it, and belief happens. But belief can be motivated. Sometimes we believe the story that frees us to do what we already want.
If Anne was innocent, Henry faced an ugly truth. He was abandoning a woman for whom he had transformed his kingdom. If Anne was guilty, Henry became the betrayed husband. Suddenly, his next marriage was not selfish. It was necessary. He was not discarding Anne. Anne had deceived him. He was the victim. That story had psychological value. It also had political value. We cannot prove that Henry consciously manufactured that narrative, but we should notice how perfectly it solved his problems. Anne's conviction did not merely remove her, it morally exonerated him. Or tried to. The court's speed also suggests that there was little room for genuine defense. Anne had no independent legal team in the modern sense. She faced a political court inside a monarchy where the king's wishes shaped careers, fortunes, and survival.
The peers judging her knew who would still be king tomorrow. They also knew what had happened to people who stood too firmly against Henry. Imagine being on that jury. You are a nobleman. The government has charged the Queen with treason. Her alleged lovers have already been convicted. Thomas Cromwell is running the machinery. Henry wants the case concluded. You look around the room. How eager are you to say, "Actually, Your Majesty, I think your wife is innocent, and your chief minister has fabricated the whole thing." Exactly. Tudor courage had a very expensive subscription fee. And yet we must avoid saying the trial was fake in every legal sense. Procedures existed. Commissions were issued. Grand juries considered indictments. Peers sat in judgment. Records were created. This was not a midnight disappearance with no paperwork. In some ways, that makes the case more disturbing. The machinery of law was used. Official seals, formal language, jurisdiction, verdicts, sentences. An injustice, if that is what happened, did not occur outside the legal system. It occurred through it. That distinction matters far beyond Anne Boleyn. People often imagine that law and abuse of power are opposites. History says power frequently prefers paperwork. A signature makes violence look respectable. By the time Anne reached the scaffold, the state had transformed a queen into a convicted traitor through a sequence of official acts. Arrest, interrogation, indictment, trial, verdict, annulment, execution order. Every step looked administrative. The final result was a severed head. This is why the Anne Boleyn case still grips us, not because we are obsessed with royal romance, not only because Henry VIII had 6 wives, not because the Tower has excellent atmosphere for a ghost story. We are fascinated because the story forces us to ask how quickly a person's reality can be rewritten when powerful institutions agree on a narrative. On April 18th, 1536, Anne was still publicly being treated as Henry's queen in an important diplomatic encounter. By May 2nd, she was a prisoner. By May 15th, a traitor. By May 19th, dead. 1 month. Your status can change faster than your furniture delivery. There is no modern equivalent that fully captures the shock. Imagine a first lady, prime minister's spouse, celebrity, religious symbol, and political faction leader combined into one person. Now imagine the government announcing that within days she has been exposed as sexually corrupt, incestuous, murderous, and treasonous. Then imagine there is no appeal, no independent press investigation,
No televised interview. No forensic review. No long legal process. And by next week, she is gone. That is the scale. The speed is part of the terror. After Anne's death, Henry married Jane Seymour. In 1537, Jane gave birth to the son Henry had wanted for decades, Edward. Jane died shortly afterward from complications following childbirth. Edward would eventually become Edward VI, and Anne's daughter Elizabeth, once declared illegitimate after her mother's fall, would later become Elizabeth I. There is a strange justice in that outcome, though not one Anne lived to see. Her daughter survived. Not easily. Elizabeth spent her youth navigating the deadly politics created by her father's marriages. She learned caution. She learned performance. She learned how dangerous marriage could be for a ruling woman. Elizabeth never married. We should be careful about drawing a straight psychological line from her mother's execution to that decision. Historians debate Elizabeth's motives, and politics played a huge role. Still, the image is hard to ignore. The daughter of Anne Boleyn grew up in a world where marriage had destroyed her mother, nearly destroyed her legitimacy, and repeatedly destabilized the succession. If Elizabeth ever needed a cautionary tale about husbands and power, she did not have to read one. It was her family history. Today, Anne's grave lies inside the Tower's Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula. Visitors walk through a place that has become both tourist attraction and national memory. And of course, there are ghost stories. Anne's spirit has supposedly been seen wandering the tower, sometimes carrying her head. The carrying the head detail feels slightly unfair. Even in death, apparently, a woman cannot travel light. Ghost legends say more about the living than the dead. We want Anne to haunt the tower because her story feels unfinished. But the unfinished part is not really the ghost. It is the verdict and the man at the center of it. The man who pursued her and the monarch who condemned her were the same person. There was no secret villain replacing him, no magical transformation, only power revealing which part of the relationship had always been stronger. When love and sovereignty collided, sovereignty won. Every time. So imagine Anne again on that final morning. The tower is familiar, that is important. She had once come here in triumph. Before her coronation, she occupied royal apartments prepared for celebration. Now, the same fortress holds her prisoner. The walls have not betrayed her. The king has. Outside, London continues. People buy food. Boats move along the Thames. Merchants open shops. Children wake. Servants work. Most human beings are living an ordinary Friday. Inside the tower, a queen is preparing to die. That contrast is almost impossible to bear. History's famous days were ordinary mornings for millions of people. There was breakfast, there was weather, there were errands, and somewhere the world changed. Anne steps onto the scaffold. She speaks carefully. She does not scream innocence at the crowd. She does not curse Henry. She prays. She submits to the sentence. And then the sword falls. The official case closes. The historical case begins. 5 centuries later, we are still reviewing it. Not because we can reverse the verdict, not because we can rescue Anne, but because examining failed justice is one way the dead can still warn the living. Watch the speed. Watch the incentives. Watch the language. Watch what happens when accusation becomes identity before evidence is tested. Watch how people behave when the desired conclusion belongs to the most powerful person in the room. Watch how quickly friends become suspects. Watch how easily procedure can become theater.
Watch how reputation can be destroyed so thoroughly that invented details outlive the evidence. And watch the difference between a woman being complicated and a woman being guilty. Those two things are still confused. Anne Boleyn does not need us to prove she was perfect. She needs us to read the file. And the file is troubling. That may be the best answer history can give. Not certainty, but trouble. Enough trouble that the official Tudor verdict should never be repeated without question.
Enough trouble that the label adulteress tells us more about the prosecution than it does about Anne. Enough trouble that incest belongs in the category of accusation, not established fact. Enough trouble that Cromwell's role deserves scrutiny. Enough trouble that Henry's responsibility cannot be outsourced. Enough trouble that the phrase fair trial feels almost impossible to use without irony. And enough trouble that, when people ask whether Anne Boleyn was framed, the most responsible answer is, very possibly in important respects, and certainly prosecuted in a process that gives us profound reasons to doubt the result. That is less dramatic than a conspiracy board with red string. It is also more honest, and perhaps more frightening, because if no perfect conspiracy was required, then the lesson is broader. You do not need everyone to lie.
You need enough people to stop asking whether the story is true. That is how a queen can disappear in 17 days. That is how a rumor becomes a charge. A charge becomes a verdict. A verdict becomes history. And history becomes a rhyme children memorize without hearing the woman inside it. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Anne gets one word: beheaded. But behind that word is a courtship that changed England, a marriage that changed the church, a daughter who changed history, a political conflict, a miscarriage, a rival, a minister, a confession. 5 accused men, impossible dates, a rushed trial, an annulment, a sword, a grave, and a question mark that has survived longer than the dynasty itself. Was Anne Boleyn, the Queen, framed to die? We may never know exactly who wrote the first line of the ending, but by May 1536, too many powerful people had reasons to finish the page, and Anne no longer held the pen.